I appreciate everybody joining. Go over what iOS 13, some of the new stuff in there that really relates to the enterprise. A little bit about me. I am our CDW Healthcare Mobility Solution Architect here at CDW. So I cover the Central and East Territory for CDW Healthcare. So in doing that, I work with a variety of practices from very small clinics to very large organizations, just helping organizations figure out mature mobility strategies. A lot of that is around Apple and how we deliver that successfully in an organization. So just a little bit about me and where I come from. What I'll dive into today is some of the enrollment changes around Apple in iOS 13, enterprise identity, so the new single sign-on extensions, manage Apple IDs, some changes around iPadOS, and then I'll dig into some of the new supervised restrictions and payloads available that are configured through your MDM. But getting into it, changes to enrollment. So when Apple first really came to the industry, we had two different ways to manage devices. Device enrollment, which is a very common method. Go to a URL or download the agent, enroll it, profile delivered to the device. Apple then introduced automated device enrollment, which is using things like DEP to automate the provisioning process of Apple. And then we also brought in BYOD. So some of the challenges that a lot of organizations really voiced around BYOD was there was no really separations for personal and privacy. So with iOS 13, Apple really has changed that with something called user enrollment. What user enrollment is it's a third method of managing devices. And if any of you guys follow Vector on YouTube, I really liked his line around this. He said, drawing the line on who owns the devices. I think that's mirrors what Apple's trying to do here. It is a new way of managing devices, and it's specifically aimed at BYOD devices. This is a personal device. This is not something the corporation owns, and the goal there is to protect privacy and personal data. We'll go into a little bit about what user enrollment is, but the one thing I want to get out of the way is it is an MDM profile that we're putting on the device. We're still putting a profile. So if you go into general settings, profiles, there's something still there, but it's restricting a lot of the things that we can do on the device. User enrollment is not multi-user, it is multi-persona, and I'll go into that factor, but a lot of times I hear organizations trying to mix that up because we are putting things like a managed Apple ID on there, so I see where people are thinking, hey, multi-user on iPhone, it's just a multi-persona, so I want to get that out of the way real quick. But what user enrollment is, user enrollment can configure accounts, it can configure per app VPN, install apps and configure, require a passcode, a simple passcode. So we can enforce things like an alphanumeric passcode or a 16-digit passcode or something like that. And enforcing restrictions, certain restrictions, there are limitations of what we can. And then we're still able to manage company apps, company accounts, and configurations on the device. We can enroll a device, and we can delete company data onto that, that's on that device. That's everything we can do with user enrollment. What we can't do is obtaining things like serial MEID. So as a mobility admin, if I threw a device into a Jamf or an AirWatch, I can go in that device and actually see all this data. The serial, the IMEI, and stuff like that. If a device is being tossed into user enrollment, we are not able to see that anymore. That is personal information to that user. That user owns that device, so Apple's taking the stance that we can't see that. We can't require complex passwords, so alphanumeric. We can enforce a 6-pin passcode. So that's about it. That's the only thing we can do on the device. We can't enforce a 4-pin either. We can't go downgrade the device security at that point, but so more simple passcode management. We can't clear the passcode or downgrade the security. So clear the passcode is, hey, I've gone through 10 times and my device is frozen. Typically in the MDM, we can go into the device and hit clear the passcode. We are not allowed to do that anymore just because it is a personal device. Enforcing specific supervised restrictions. As you get into, as mobility admins, as you go into Jamf or AirWatch or other MDMs, you're going to start seeing a lot of the restrictions that are available are actually going to be supervised only. So Apple's specifically removing a lot of restrictions that way, and so we're a little bit more limited in what we can do for user enrollment, and that's really by design what Apple's doing here. Additionally, remotely wiping the entire device. So we can enterprise wipe the device. So any applications, corporate data that we put on the device, we can remove, but we cannot nuke that device. So we can't, which is for the end user, ensuring that, hey, if they're not using iCloud and we wipe the device, all the pictures, text messages, and all that stuff is gone. So accessing any cellular features, we can't do one of the new restrictions that we can enable in iOS 13 is things like controlling the hotspot, so we can't do any of that, and then enforcing an always-on VPN. So we can do a per-app VPN, so if we do have applications on the device that we are managing that need to remote home, we can enforce a per-app VPN on managed applications, just not on the full device. Any questions around there? Great.
So the always-on VPN, we can't enforce that for the entire device, but can we still enforce that at an application level?
Yes, per app VPN works on managed apps only. So that's you make a good point. So we can, one of the other things that when a device is user enrolled, we can't take control of applications either. This is something that Apple is honestly still working through. So say we have a physician or a provider wants to enroll in our MDM to get access to email and stuff like that. Maybe our MDM, when they enroll, we also give applications like Rover or anything like that. If the physician already has, say, Rover on that device, typically, before iOS 13, we could ask to manage that app. That is not allowed anymore. So there are some things that Apple honestly is still working through. But we can't ask to manage apps anymore. We can still push apps through VPP, Volume Purchasing Program, to the applications, but we can't ask to manage those anymore. So, but per app VPN still works. So we can do an AirWatch tunnel or other VPN tunnel on a per app VPN basis. Good questions. I appreciate that. So a little bit more on the technical stuff. What user enrollment is doing is it's creating a separate APFS volume on the device. That volume is totally encrypted and separate from the user volume. So anything that we push there, our managed apps, our configurations, our corporate policies and restrictions are on that separate APS volume. That is totally separate from their personal iCloud as well. Native apps like Notes, Files, iCloud Drive, some third-party apps are completely separated. There are some instances where native apps like Mail and Calendar are partially separated. So Mails shares both the encrypted and the personal volume, and what's in there is previews and some metadata. Calendar events are made on the user volume. So just some instances where there's partial sharing there, but it is when we are doing user enrollment, there's two encrypted volumes on there. And in 90% of the cases, applications aren't corporate applications data is not touching the personal. And then upon unenrollment, that separate volume is completely destroyed. The encryption keys, all the data, corporate apps, and configurations are completely removed. So for PHI and for HIPAA security and everything, that is all destroyed. What this looks like, so you've got managed apps. So that share, when we go back down to not multi-user but multi-persona, you're gonna start seeing more applications take advantage of this. But applications like the files and the notes, when we have a additional persona on there, so managed Apple ID, which I'll get into, you're actually going to see two accounts on there. So you can switch between your accounts, my personal account in Files and my corporate account in Files. So we'll have some multi-persona within the applications. And you're going to start seeing more and more developers adding multi-persona to their applications, because the challenge that we're seeing, which is why Apple's still working through this, is not all the applications can have multi-persona. Android is a great example. With Android Enterprise, we're starting to see what Google has done is they've they allow 2 applications on a device, and your corporate application has a little briefcase next to it. So there's complete separation there. Apple's not going that route where they have 2 of the same applications on a device. So more and more applications are building multi-persona into the application, so we have a corporate and a personal account on there. My recommendation for you, user enrollment is I wouldn't like wipe and reset any existing devices out there that are already provisioned. I would say use user enrollment as a new method for new BYO users. I wouldn't go through the effort of trying to unenroll and then re-enroll in user enrollment. That's just going to be a lot of work there. So user enrollment's for, I would say, newer BYO. And then where we enable user enrollment is in your MDM. So this is a screenshot from my AirWatch lab, but Jamf, Mobile Iron, Monster 360 are going to be pretty similar as well, where you're just going to enable that user enrollment. Each MDM is going to be a little different, but based on the organization group and the username, your URL may change as well. For directing users to a different URL, like with MOS 360, we'll go to a user enrollment URL instead of the device enrollment. So that may change as well. So I would recommend reaching out to your MDM to, most of them have some good documentation around user enrollment by now, but I would recommend reaching out to them, to your respective MDMs. Hey, how do we enable user enrollment? What are the things that we need to look into or change workflows around? But that is enabled directly through your MDM. I'll get into what's changed for supervised device enrollment. So this is going to apply to devices that are coming from Apple's DEP or Apple's Business Manager. So some new stuff that we can do here, and it really comes down to just branding the automated enrollment process. So previously, when we had a Mac or an iOS device, when we put it through and we turned it on, hit that hello screen, and we hit Wi-Fi, that very next screen asks the user to authenticate, and then you see this nice remote management. So that was the old way. With iOS 13, you can actually put your own branding here, as well as terms and conditions and stuff like that. So we can have more of our own logos and customization around the enrollment process, so the users know, hey, I'm enrolling into my organization this way. So just some new branding there, available with iOS 13. Again, that is going to be managed through your MDM. So your MDMs, if most of them, when you go to edit your DEP profile that you created when you token authenticated the server between ABM and your MDM, most likely it's going to be in that configuration that you're going to enable this. But again, refer to your MDM on documentation on that one. And I like to show this. So altogether, even with all the changes that we have here, I always get questions from a lot of organizations and just their end users as what an MDM can and can't do on their devices. So this is everything that an MDM can see and can't see. So I just like to kind of show that. So user enrollment changes a couple things, but I think it's important for end users to understand that, we can't see their phone number, we can't see their text messages, whether it's a supervised device or not, and stuff like that. Great. We'll get into enterprise identity. So we're going to talk about managed Apple IDs and the new single sign-on extensions available. So managed Apple IDs, this is really important. Managed Apple IDs, where you're really going to see these come from is using user enrollment. So one of the things I didn't talk about is when that multi-persona, that corporate persona is actually a managed Apple ID. Managed IDs are really going to be used for user enrollment. There's not going to be a lot of use cases where you would need to add multiple managed IDs for supervised devices, especially like shared devices where a lot of times I see organizations not even using iCloud. We're moving those services all together and just using VPP. But within Apple Business Manager, you have the ability to push out managed Apple IDs really specifically for user enrollment. Additionally, you can create those managed Apple IDs manually, or if you are on Azure Active Directory, you can federate that using Azure Active Directory. And then user enrollment will require a managed Apple ID. So, and that managed Apple ID also will flow with the user. So if they change devices, add devices, same managed Apple ID for that user on multiple devices, similar to your iCloud account that you even use. One thing that I will say, most organizations have made the change yet, but if you have not upgraded to Apple Business Manager, you will need to do so by December 5th. The legacy portal deploy.apple.com, Apple will be ending life on December 1st. So I want to make sure that that's out there. So if we do have anybody still on there, we want to make that transition. If you haven't made the transition yet, it's pretty seamless. I haven't got any real negative feedback around there. We don't have to change any of our existing username and passwords. We don't have to re-enroll devices or anything. It's really, it's mostly a UI change, but it really combines VPP and DEP all together. So if anyone wants to have a tour of Apple Business Manager or a little bit more in-depth around there, I'm happy to do so. We can work with your CDW account managers, and I'm happy to schedule 30 to 40 minutes to go over Apple Business Manager. Apple single sign-on. So this is something a lot of organizations are asking around. So it applies to both iOS and macOS. I'm going to throw iPadOS in there as well. It works right now with native apps and Safari, so Apple's already built the extensions into their native apps. SSO is managed through your MDM, and it can apply to both native and native applications, applications that come from VPP or the Apple App Store or web as well. So, and there is some prerequisites to make this work that I'll get into, but the biggest thing I want to do around single sign-on is single sign-on is not sign-in with Apple. I don't want that to get confused at all. Sign-in with Apple is more of a consumer product that you're going to start seeing deployed more and more within applications. So single sign-on is specifically an enterprise feature. But to make single sign-on work, it requires three pieces. An application has to support it. The single sign-in extension, so and then the identity provider. The identity provider can be things like Active Directory Federated Services. It can be a ping, an Okta. And then the single sign-in extension, it's an XML script. So your app developers need to enable this within their application. So they actually have to update the application. Apple has provided some XML code that they would need to enter in there, but essentially, if you go into your MDM console, which I'll show you guys in a second, if you go in your MDM console and you start, this is a screenshot I took from my own Workspace ONE configuration. So with an Epic Rover, Epic would need to update their app to allow an XML configuration, and then you would enter that XML configuration in this key value here. That is how that works. So the biggest takeaway here is the application has to be updated in order to use this, and then your identity provider has to be updated to use that as well. So there's some layers there that just have to happen. And so to me, it's not going to be something that, great, let's just roll out to all our applications. There's some layers there, but Apple's opened up the framework to allow that to happen. So I would say, over the 6 to 12 months, you're probably going to start seeing more enterprise applications start to take advantage of this. So, and it is a Kerberos value we are using Kerberos as part of the extension here. In the very end of this presentation, I have a resource guide, a link to a resource guide from Apple that goes over all the, goes over specifically SSO and Kerberos authentication, all the values and fields that need to be there. So if you want your application to support that, I recommend touching base with that application developer to see where they are at as far as supporting this new framework from Apple. Let's talk about iPadOS. So I've enjoyed iPadOS. I have it on my Gen 1 iPad Pro. That's pretty aged at this point, but it is Safari now is the desktop class browser. So it is not just an agent change from a mobile agent to a desktop agent. There's a little bit more behind the scenes but it's great for use cases that are looking to more make it a true laptop replacement, or solves the problem of applications, web apps that we may use that are loading the mobile sites, and we've got a bigger screen to take advantage of more real estate. The biggest thing around iPadOS is it can change the enrollment process for some MDMs. Some MDMs use the WebKit framework, and what that does is it identifies the device type being enrolled. So if your MDM, if you use URL-based enrollment, so we go to a URL within the Safari browser, which then gives us the profile to download and install. Some MDMs that use the WebKit JR framework, that enrollment process will not work because that URL is viewing that Safari browser as a Mac. That's essentially what is happening. So it thinks that that device is a Mac and not sending the right profile for essentially an iOS enrollment. So I have confirmed MOS 360 does not use the WebKit JR framework. The Mobile Iron does not. So but there's a lot of different MDMs out there. Some organizations have multiple MDMs. So just be wary if you go and try to enroll in the URL and the profile installs fine, then you're good. The MDM is not using that framework to identify the device type. But just putting that out there, depending on how the MDM has developed, could cause some issues. All right, and the last piece that I'll go over here is just some of the new supervised restrictions in iOS. We'll also cover a little bit about macOS and tvOS, but content caching, there are some improvements to content caching. So if you're not aware of content caching, what this allows you to do, it's you need a Mac OS device. So it can be a Mac Mini, Mac Pro, MacBook Pro, MacBook Air. But natively within macOS, you can enable content caching, and what that allows you to do is it'll cache any iOS updates or Apple App Store updates onto the device, and then any devices that need that iOS update or that application, it'll actually download from that cache server instead of asking the internet for it. I've seen this deployed in a variety of different ways with shared environments where we're using things like ground control or Apple Provision Utility, where we're wiping and resetting and constantly re-enrolling devices. Caching removes some of the bottlenecking that we see on the network. I've also seen some organizations that put this on the guest network. So if we have patients that are coming in and downloading Candy Crush on our guest network and stuff like that, it caches all that, so removes the bottlenecking on the guest network. But there are some improvements in content caching. Specifically, we can prefer a specific server that we want those devices to go to for the content and stuff like that.
Oh, you're fine over there. This one goes right in under my desk.
Okay. The setup assistant, so we can, when we set up our DEP profile, we can skip a lot of different panes in there, so we can just hit hello, internet, authenticate, and you're in. Within iOS 13, we can now skip dark mode and skip the welcome pane. Activation lock is once a device enrolled, those activation lock tokens are automatically archived into the MDM. Additionally, some payloads improvements here as well. I'll let you guys read through this, but if you have any questions or anything, give me a holler on that, but it's a lot of content to look at. And again, I will send a PDF version of this so you guys can look at that, and the documentation listed in the resource guide will also have all of this detailed out as well. As far as restrictions, restrictions to allow or prevent specific applications or actions, we can further control iTunes, Safari, explicit content to supervised devices only. And new restrictions for iPad and OS. So we can restrict, as far as supervised settings, we can restrict allowing Find My Friends, Find My iPhone, and modifying whether Wi-Fi is on or off, which is new. That's something we still can't control whether Bluetooth is on or off, but we can control Wi-Fi, whether Wi-Fi is on or off for now as well. Additionally, some additional supervised restrictions, we can control hotspot modification. So if we want to turn that on or off, that is available as well. One of the new things with iOS 13, any devices that come from Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager are going to be default enabled to required MDM enrollment and will also require supervision. That is something that before iOS 13 we could control. So if we put them through ABM, they don't have to be supervised, and we could disable require MDM enrollment, but that is now required with iOS 13. So If we just hit disable on your DEP profile, that's going to be voided. It's automatically going to be supervised. As far as active sync exchange, so this comes down to that multi-persona, but enabling calendars and contacts or reminders will be managed individually for different accounts. So if we're putting a corporate email onto the native mail client, that is a multi-persona, so we can manage that separately. And then additional commands and queries that are available. So if we are using eSIMs, we can query for those, requesting unlocked tokens, and querying for manage-only options as well. So those are some of the new things that are in iOS 13, specifically for iOS and iPadOS. Any questions on everything that we just went through? Great. Some small stuff on macOS. So if we are managing a macOS through here, we can supervise that as well. So typically macOS device didn't really have, you can enroll through Apple Business Manager, but there's not a lot you can do with that. When it does get enrolled through Apple Business Manager, it actually is supervised. So it's getting closer to the way iOS is managed. And there is a supervision profile that we can install on that device. I was actually on Twitter last night, and it looks like that supervision profile can't be removed either on macOS devices. So I saw some chatter on that on Twitter yesterday, but we can skip the screen time and the Touch ID pane for macOS. And then if we are managing tvOS, which can be a device that you can manage through a Jamf, an AirWatch, or MDM client, and it does apply to supervision, so there are some supervised only restrictions for tvOS as well. I've seen tvOS used within things like patient settings and stuff like that, but those are some changes there. But that is what I had prepared for you guys all. I hope that was helpful. This is your resource guide. So on here I put Apple's developer WWDC content that back from May or June. It links you directly to a video. It's about an hour video that goes over pretty much everything I went over today. What's new for enterprise and education? This is a document. It's about 15 pages, but it goes over everything that I went over a little bit more in detail. You can things like the KERBOS values that are needed for applications for SSO. And then in here, I also linked my mobility enabling kit. This is these are documents that I specifically created to aid in figuring out mobility strategy as well as some evaluation guides here. So that's all content that you guys that is available to you guys. But I appreciate the time. I hope it was valuable for you guys.